Hello, in this video I want to talk a little bit more about the worker strike in relationship to settler colonialism, a new series that I started in the last video that I would definitely watch if you want context to what I'll be talking about in this series. In the last video, I did the intro to worker strike and settler colonialism, or settler colonialism and the worker strike, basically talking about what I thought some of the central problems that settler colonialism takes up with the resolution for the worker strike resolutions coming up for LD, and the ways in which I think it kind of sets up really good central arguments for the negative and the affirmative, and why I think it's really important for you to be able to prepare for this strategy or be ready to read it, because I think on both sides it'll definitely be something that, as it's always been in a lot of resolutions of debate, really important and really classic in terms of its debate with Marx and the way that people I think can debate it out on this resolution in relationship to like the sovereign in Marx. I think has some really interesting angles, and so hopefully this set of videos will be really helpful in terms of like getting you a better idea of what this argument is and how it works on all different sides of the debate. In this particular set of videos, I want to talk a little bit about what this strategy looks like on the negative versus policy teams, which is where I think this strategy will show up the most if it's not like on the affirmative most times. I think that a lot of the arguments that are like really good for this resolution are really good against the policy teams and can make them force them to defend a lot of stuff about the worker strike that I think that they might not be as comfortable with and might not get as much access to in other debates. And so I definitely think it's an interesting point to really start a lot of your offense from. And so I definitely in this video I want to start just a little bit talking about like what I think are some of the general priorities, and then thinking about how that affects some of the other portions of the actual kind of debate when we think about some of the more like framing, thesis, link, permutation kind of stuff, nitty gritty portions of the debate. I think that at the top, when we're just kind of just thinking about like what are the priorities for this type of criticism to make it effective against policy teams, I definitely think the first thing that you want to do is like really delegitimize the worker strike as something that is revolutionary, as something that can create some type of like creative action that is able to overcome a lot of the violence that's happening in the status quo. I feel like a lot of the arguments that come from the worker strike team that will be like used against this criticism are a lot of link-turn arguments about the ways in which the worker strike pertains to creating like conditions in which we can think about like things like redistribution and like unfair seizure and the production of scarcity in ways that allow us to kind of like resolve some of the impacts to the criticism that we'll talk about a little bit later on. But I think what's really important for you is to start off with a really strong indictment of why the worker strike as a framework, whether recognized by the state or not, is probably bound to fail, which I think is obviously well done to various types of historical critiques that really take it through understanding why both like Marxist theory at a level when it's thinking about the worker is like wrong or bad, or thinking about the ways in which worker strikes historically have kind of been bad, and being able to think about like what various forms of like kind of like freedom or resistance to genocide really looks like. I then think that once you've kind of got that central indictment of like what the worker strike looks like, which we'll talk about more as the videos kind of go on, I think that the next thing that you really want to focus on and put a lot of priority on is how can you delegitimize the necessary like creation of like a sovereign that is like outside of the bounds of what you're critiquing. I feel like a lot of people will take kind of like the framing of like a just government as a way to like frame out critiques that are really contextualized to the U.S. or the U.S.'s history, and say that like those links don't really apply as much. But I think that you really want to make an argument about how things like genocide and settler colonialism like follow the way in which we're able to adopt and think about the existence of the state and modernity like whatsoever, because of the way in which like settler colonialism is able to continually haunt the various types of political processes that we kind of take up and think of as normative, as just, as moral and good, and can continue to do so regardless of whether or not that sovereign is like directly the U.S. or something else. And I feel like a lot of the arguments that you really want to start making are about why that kind of recognition is still invested in the same type of like pathology and the creation of like an innocent subject that is able to easily like forget and erase like genocide, in the way in which settler colonialism is kind of such a important like structure for how we're able to think of the conditions of violence and the way in which they're continually able to like operate and move historically. I then think that when you kind of like take this advice and transition into what you should be doing more specifically on things like the framing debate, I feel like your framing debate here needs to be a really big argument into like you should be like they should have to defend right the worker strike and the advantages that come from it. I really feel like a lot of the arguments that you can make about like why the way in which you're thinking about the resolution are good are mostly based in how can you kind of start getting your impact comparison arguments moved on well, because I feel like you'll have like links to the plain text. I feel like you'll have like really set link arguments to what the affirmative does. I really feel like it's a question of how can you get to the judge's evaluation on your side. This is like the types of arguments where you want to make like kind of like rule the judge type arguments or rule debate arguments that are really about why revolutionary forms of decision making that don't prioritize like normative impact calculus, that don't prioritize like normative ways of like valuing particular like policies and ways of thinking about action. And that kind of allows you to do a couple of things. The first first thing it does is that it sets up a lot of ways for you to push arguments about why those particular forms of education and thinking about violence are particularly important, which allows you to kind of like set up, like I said before, a lot of the impact framing arguments that you're going to make later on. But I also think that it's really important to do this in order for you to kind of lower the standard for what your alternative needs to do, because your framing debate is really making an argument about why the process of debating that you're taking up in that debate is particularly good. And so a lot of the framing arguments that you're kind of like making are reasons why the alternative doesn't necessarily need to create some type of productive crazy change outside of debate, because you probably already have some indite of fiat or futurism hopefully within this framing argument, and it's just a question of how you can kind of add on these other portions that show why the way in which they're kind of like thinking about how we should evaluate what is like material action or what debate produces is bad as well, therefore giving you more credence for like why your explanation of the alternative is simply refusal or something that's just like, you know, not having to win a substantial change in like the status quo's material substances. I think would be really good for you to be in a place so that you don't have to like spend a lot of time there if you don't want to, but also give yourself wiggle room to be able to use the framing arguments as advantages and net benefits to the way that you're really explaining the alternative on like a flip side debate where you really do want to go for it. I definitely think that on the thesis portion of the debates, this is where you really want to start your strong indite of the worker strike that I was talking about before. I think that, like I said in that first video, the things that you really want to focus on in terms of talking about the worker strike are first really indicting just like the subject position of the worker and the idea that it has this kind of like universalized way of like connecting people and allowing like mutual demands for accountability towards various types of communities, etc., and make arguments about how the state's kind of bestowal of rights onto the worker strike is a way to legitimize a kind of subject position that only exists out of the accumulation and continued like dispossession of like native land, and also allows the continued like hoarding and usage of resources at a more ethical lens, from the lens of like corporations and those that are already doing violent ways of like indigenous dumping, etc., or dumping on indigenous lands, etc., because of the ways in which worker strike combines resistance to those that are like within the company, which doesn't actually protect those that have like interests outside of whether or not things are like in gain for those that are working there, right? There could be like positive working conditions in a company that is still able to produce violence for those that are on the outside purview of that, or that are in the communities of where these things are located. And I think that you making arguments about how this kind of like actually scales up to being a much more global paradigm of how we just think about how scarcity is produced along lines that are created within genocide and not through the lens of just what is divided from the worker and those that are kind of like bestowing and giving value to the labor's commodity, and making arguments about why that kind of clear-cut line doesn't actually allow for a really texture analysis of how violence is produced along different vectors and the ways in which the worker strike will only delegitimize other forms of resistance against that type of paradigm. Hopefully this video is helpful for you and hopefully allow you to at least have framing for the other videos I'll be doing talking about settler colonialism and the worker strike. And yeah, thank you as always.